Good morning, everyone. So welcome to chapter 2. Before anything else, wanted to thank a lot of people that flagged the correction. So 1.3. So apologies. Parang we overlooked the bare LTV. So I think this is also so sorry. So number one, sorry, our bad. So dapat we have double check the check answer key. But second, I think it highlights ano yung mga challenges in terms of answering accounting. So the difference here is that in the original birth, it's the beginning of the year, and then the bear is at the end of the year. So same formula, very different scenarios, right? So basically, tama naman yung ginawa natin na we plugged in the values at the start and then we found the ending balance and then yung changes in between for the original birth. But yung problem here is yung sa bear. So initially, in terms of our discussion, we plugged in 4 million and 1.85 million sa taas, right? And it gave us completely different answers. So apologies for that confusion. What we should have done instead is that same framework, same table, you have your beginning, your change, and your end. Pero at the same time, iibahin mo lang kung saan mo pinlog. So same framework, different logins, right? So 4 million liabilities, 1.85 million sa equity sa ending, and then 500, 150. So you have two ways of going about it, but for me, I like completing the accounting equation first. So I always start with, ano ba yung kulang here? Alam na natin yung liabilities and equity. So basically what we do is add 4 million and 1.85 million. That gives you 5.85 million. From there, we can then solve for the ones sa beginning. So alam natin na 4 million siya, but during the year, it decreased by 500,000. So ang knee-jerk reaction nyo would be to subtract 500,000 to 4 million. But mali, pabaliktad, right? Because it's beginning to end. Therefore, it's actually 4.5 million at the start. And then baliktad naman sa 1.85 million equity. It increased raw to 150,000. Meaning, dapat we subtract 150,000 to get 1.7, and then finally you'll get your asset by adding the two liabilities and equity. So 6.2, and then simple subtraction lang. So 5.85 million minus 6.2 million is 350,000. So these are the correct answers. So I also posted that on Facebook, and then meron din kaming Excel na pinost. So parang as much as possible, I tried to parang do the formula so you can find it for yourself. But if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And then second, to avoid yung parang wasting your time na parang mali pala yung check figure, I'll also create a thread for problem set 2 wherein you can flag na, oy, parang, sir, parang is there something wrong? And then parang if common na yun yung problem, then you can be assured na, okay, skip muna natin to and then let's wait for the feedback from the department. So second, same exercise, add muna 5.85 and then ito baliktad na naman. So it decreased by 350,000, meaning at the start mas malaki siya. So you have 6.2 million here and then ito it decreased, so it increased by 250. So 3.75 4 million to get your equity at 2.45 million and then a decrease of 600,000. So with that said, I think clean na tayo in terms of chapter 1. Kindly let me know if my questions, but now we'll move on to the recording process. So I think in terms of the discussion, the question that we always say is it accounting just like bookkeeping? And this is actually where the confusion comes in, diba? That there are 3 components, but ang pinakaalam lang ng mga tao would be the recording process. So now, alam na natin yung background, like how to make accounting make sense for anyone in terms of like different fields. But now we're looking at it from a more accounting lens, right? So 3 major things that we want to do, still applying our BAA framework. So first, we're gonna broaden our understanding of the recording process. So we will define what are accounts, and then we will understand finally, ano ba yung debit and credit? As in any time na you mention accounting, if you ask people, what's the thing that you think about? You see debit and credit, right? So what does that mean? And then from there, we're gonna take a deep dive into how do you actually account for transactions. So what are the steps in the recording process? Let's learn how to create journal entries. And then finally, let's learn how to post. And then finally, we have our trial balance, just so that we can prepare the trial balance so that we can analyze our financial statements better. So for me, things are key takeaways that you have to understand here. Dapat number 1, you master the normal accounts. Meaning ano ba, kung ano yung normal ng mga different accounts. So that's the debits and their credits. Number 2, understand how journal entries work. 3 would be how to post and understand ano yung ledger. And then number 4, yung trial balance. Right? So yun, 4 things lang that we want to accomplish for today. So to start, ano nga ba ang debit and credit? So a lot of times people would mistake na a debit means increase, credit means decrease. But honestly, it's nothing fancy. Debit and credit literally means left and right. So debit and credit, left and right. So why then do we parang use debit and credit in accounting? Well, like what I've mentioned, if napapansin nyo, para kung paulit-ulit na plaka during our first case study, which is the Bullish Launch Agency, na every time may economic event, we try to maintain the balance. What's the balance? That your assets is equal to your liabilities and your equity. So parang siyang seesaw, kailangan perfectly balanced siya. In the sense that your assets on the left should equal to your liabilities and equity to your right, right? So in essence, the first step is understand natin, ano ba yung mga accounts? Well, an account is basically a building block. So it's an individual accounting record of increases and decreases in a specific either asset, liability, or equity. So what do we mean by this? So meron kang assets, may liabilities ka and equities, and these are classes, right? Accounts are the specific items under each. So ano yung mga accounts? Cash, receivables, supplies. Those are all accounts, but they're categorized as assets. Sa liabilities naman, ano yung mga accounts natin? Accounts payable, accrued expenses, basically yung mga notes payable, etc., etc. And then equity, we have our 4 accounts. So palagi, ano yung 4 components of equity? That's owner's capital, owner's drawings, revenues, and expenses. So when I say account, I pertain to all of these things under each groups of assets, liabilities, and equity. Now, basically, iba-iba kasi the way businesses run. Diba? So for example, you have a gaming company, you have a restaurant startup business, you have a fine dining restaurant. The first question is, how do they name their accounts? Like for example, we have a bakery. They'd probably categorize it as utilities expense, right? And then we go to another company na basically parang fanboy sila ng Meralco. So rather than saying utilities expense, they wanna name it Meralco expense. So they both incur, let's say, 5,000 na electricity expense. Under company A, they'll categorize it as utilities expense. Under company B, they'll categorize it as Meralco expense. Technically, they're one and the same. Pero malilito kayo kasi bakit pa iba-iba? Like, why is there no standard? So pag ganun, what you do is you ask for their chart of accounts. So basically, what that means is it's the list of accounts that identify their location in the ledger. So basically, if you're a company, you have so many accounts that will happen. From your cash, accounts receivable, all the way to your different kinds of expenses. So now, required ka to basically list your chart of accounts, and then you will talk about your different accounts. Ito yung mga different accounts. Ano yung account type niya, whether it's an asset, liability, an equity, or revenue, or expense. And then, saan siya lalabas sa financial statements. And then, to add another layer of location or way to locate it, you have different numbers. So 1001 transactions will pertain to cash. 5020 would talk about bank fees. So basically, if hindi nyo alam paano yung proper name of an account, you ask for the chart of accounts. And then you just use kung ano yung, so for example, if you use utilities expense, kung bumili sa supplies, mali yun. Because in their chart of accounts, it's a supplies expense rather than a utilities expense. And then, for example, nagsulat kayo, salaries and wages expense. But then, obvious naman sa chart of accounts, it's wages and expense. So, please refer to the chart of accounts for the particular problems to use the proper terms and terminology. Right? So, yun, like what I mentioned. So, parang kung utilities expense, pag nakalagay Meralco expense, put Meralco expense, kahit na, it's kind of weird for you, but yun yung nakalagay sa chart of accounts. So now, how do we record for changes in an account, right? So that's the first question. Well, basically, ang mangyayari kasi is, in Bullish Launch Agency, may cash ka, right? May starting cash ka, and then maraming transactions. Either nag-invest ka, so tumaas si cash, or gumastos ka for an expense, so bumaba si cash, or nag-generate ka ng revenue. So these accounts change from the beginning to the end of the period. So how do we track it? Well, there's this thing, and this is the first key concept that I want you to master, which would be the T account. So bakit siya T account, right? Literally, it's a T. So T account, right? So what are the components of the T account, right? So the T account shows you the story behind each account. So it will tell you the beginning balance. So yung title of account is dun ka pupunta, either cash, accounts payable, etc., etc. So under the title of the account, it will tell you ano ba yung beginning balance and ano ba yung ending balance niya, and then the various changes in the account. Now, dito papasok yung concept of debit and credit. If it's on the left of the T account, it's debit. If it's on the right, it's credit. As simple as that. So, left debit, right credit. Wala pa tayong debit means increase, credit means decrease. Please remove that connotation. Debit and credit just means left and right. And like what I mentioned, basically, ano nga ba yun? So, if we look at it as a balance in terms of the accounting equation, assets are on your left should equal your liabilities plus your equity on the right. So, debit, your left, should equal your credit or your right. So, going back to our first basic accounting equation, if our accounting equation is assets is equal to your liabilities and equity, that was our God equation for chapter 1. Chapter 2, what I want you to focus on would be debits must equal credits, not only for each transaction, but all the time. So your left should always equal your right. Every time gagawa kayo ng journal entry, every time titingnan niyo yung mga accounts, the debits should always equal your credits. So now, alam na natin, okay, the left should equal to the right. Now, let's apply it to a more complex accounting equation. So let's look at our expanded accounting equation. Technically, our debits should equal to our credits. So our assets on the left should equal to the equation liabilities plus owner's capital plus revenue minus expense minus owner's drawings, right? So with that said, parang medyo pwede naman na to, right? Pero I want it to be more intuitive for us. So paano natin gagawin? Napapansin nyo na ano ba yung two weird accounts or group of expenses on the right? It will always be expense and owner's drawings, right? Parang palagi siyang negative dun sa advanced transaction analysis. So using math, let's just put them to the left. So basically, let's eliminate them. So plus expense, plus owner's drawings, plus owner's drawings. So now, let's just rearrange the expanded accounting equation to assets plus expense plus owner's drawings is equal to liabilities plus owner's capital plus revenue. The reason being, it's simpler to look at. Wala tayong negatives. Everything is balanced. 3 is equal to 3, right? Mas maganda siya tingnan. But again, it all is derived from the expanded accounting equation that the left is equal to the right. So assets plus expense plus owner's drawings, the ones on the left, should always equal the ones on the right. Your liabilities plus owner's capital plus revenue. So with that said, meron tayong mga normal accounts. Meaning, ano ba yung normal balance of each of the groups of assets? Right? So meaning, what it means by a normal balance is, for example, assets, ang normal balance niya is a debit because nasa left siya. So any debits to cash would mean it increases. Pero any credits to cash, it will decrease, right? So another thing is, parang for example, sa expense, so basically, if you notice, the ones on the left, ang normal balance nila will be debits. The ones on the right, their normal balance would be credits. So the question is, who cares about ano ba yung normal balance nila? Because mag-iiba yung interpretation mo depending on the normal balance of each of the types of accounts. So like what I mentioned, let's take assets for example. Assets, the normal debit niya, ang normal account niya is it's a debit. So let's say, nag-invest ako ng pera, 10,000. That's an increase in asset. Since increase niya, ang normal account niya is debit, an increase will be considered a debit to cash. Pag bumaba yung cash ko ng 5,000, that's a decrease in our cash account. Meaning, hindi siya debit, but credit siya. So basically, if debit siya, it means that it follows the normal account, it will increase that particular account. Pero if it's against the normal balance, it's a credit, it would be a decrease. Pupunta naman tayo sa liabilities. Sa liabilities, unlike assets, ang normal balance is a credit. So, umutang ako ng 10,000, accounts payable. Tumaas yung liabilities of accounts payable. That's a credit of 10,000. Because nag-increase siya, that's the normal account. However, nabayaran ko yung utang ko, bumaba yung utang ko ng 5,000. Bumaba si liabilities, now that would be a debit, right? So, basically, ang tatandaan nyo lang is that, number one, i-memorize nyo or intindihin nyo kung ano yung normal account. So, debit sa left side, credit sa right. Now, ano yung mga effects? If it's a debit here, those are all increases for assets, expenses, owner's drawings. For liabilities, ang increases are yung sa credits naman, the ones on the right. So credits, owner's capital, credits, revenue, credits. Now, ano yung mga decreases? Yung baliktad. So normal account mo for asset, debit. So a decrease of that is a credit. Same with expense, credit. Owner's drawings, credit. And then for liabilities, owner's capital and revenue, their normal accounts are credit. So anything that may debit for these accounts are considered decreases for that particular account. So let's apply. Like what I mentioned, kapag tumaas yung cash natin ng 5,000, that's debit cash of 5,000. Pag bumaba ng 5,000, that's credit cash of 5,000. So again, if you see debit cash, ang first question mo is, ano ba ang normal account ng cash? Debit. So tumaas siya ng 5,000. So debit, 5,000 means 5,000 increase. Credit cash. Ano ba yung normal account ng cash? Debit. Credit is an opposite of debit. So that means nag-decrease ng 5,000. So ganun lang yung titingnan natin per account and per journal entry. So expense. Expense naman is yun, 800 expense increase is a debit in expense. A decrease in 800 of expenses is a credit in expense. Owner's drawings. So basically what I mean is pag kumuha ako ng pera from the business entity, that is an increase in our owner's drawings. So that would follow the normal account, which is debit owner's drawings. And then pag may credit or bumaba yung owner's drawings natin, that is a credit in owner's drawings. So punta naman tayo. So again, the normal balance for assets, expense, and owner's drawings are debit. Punta naman tayo sa right side. The normal balance for liabilities, owner's capital, and revenue are credits. So pag sinabi natin tumaas si liability, meaning that would be a credit in liability, right? So credit accounts payable 3,000 means tumaas si liability ng 3,000. A debit in accounts payable ng 3,000 means bumaba si accounts payable ng 3,000. Same with owner's capital. Ang normal normal account ng owner's capital is credit. So if our owner's capital increases by 100, sorry, that should be 100. It should be credit 100, debit pag bumaba siya, negative 100 in owner's capital. And then finally for revenue, tumaas si revenue ng 7,000, that's a credit in revenue. And then pag bumaba si revenue ng 7,000, that's a debit in revenue. So please, if there's one thing that I want you to memorize and master, so the one that will make or break it is dapat hindi nyo parang dapat super memorize nyo. Dapat hindi kayo malito. So again, kung parang hindi kayo malito, my suggestion is go to the expanded accounting equation. Assets is equal to liabilities plus owner's capital plus revenue minus expense minus owner's drawings. Pero ayaw natin yung negative dito sa side na to. So ililipat lang natin si expense, ililipat lang natin si owner's drawing so that it's assets plus expense plus owner's drawings on the left, liabilities plus owner's capital plus revenue on the right. Pag alam nyo na yung left and right, pag ang normal balance nila is pag left, nasa debit. So debit si assets, expense, owner's drawings. Sa liabilities, owner's capital, and revenue, credit naman yon on the right side. And then, paano nyo malalaman if it's an increase or a decrease? If it follows the normal balance, that would be an increase. Meaning, an increase in asset, expense, and owner's drawings would be debits. And then, an increase in the liabilities, owner's capital, and revenue would be credits. So basically, yun yung increases nila. And then, yung decreases naman is the one that goes against their normal balance. So, ang normal balance ng the ones on the left are debit. So, credits signify, so yung mga credits na to signify decreases in that particular account. On the other hand, for liabilities, owner's capital, and revenue, their normal balance is credit. So, pag bumaba sila, that should be debits. So now, I know it's kind of hard to medyo figure it out at the start. So now let's go back to our first case study, which is Bullish Launch Agency. So number one, let's just go and see na meron pala silang chart of accounts na parang in terms of the way they talk about their different account types or different accounts. Basically, titingnan lang natin kung ano yung mga pangalan nila. Na, okay, it's not salaries and wages expense, it's salaries expense. It's not landlord expense, it's rent expense, so etc. Right? So basically, ito lang yung reference natin, and then there are particular numbers. So as you can see, for the chart of accounts, usually it's grouped into assets, liabilities, owner's equity, revenue, and expenses. So kung mapapansin nyo, lahat ng 100s assets, lahat ng 200s liabilities. Yung mga 300s owner's equity, revenue is 400, and then expenses is 600, all the way to 800. So if you count each of the number of accounts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., you'll be able to figure out na 16 yung accounts in the chart of accounts. That would mean na there would be 16 T accounts for that particular company, right? So going back to our first case study, ito yung itsura ng advanced transaction analysis natin, right? Wherein you have the different accounts. You have your cash, your receivable, etc., all the way until your revenues and expense. Now, ang gusto kong gawin is, let's move on from the advanced transaction analysis, and then let's try to understand how to make a T account, right? So that's the first goal. So if you have the copy of your Bullish, feel free to get it, but naka-flash na rin naman siya sa screen. So basically, ang nangyari is that let's look at it vertically first. Let's look at each of the accounts, right? So sa cash, parang sobrang daming nangyari sa kanya, right? So let's make a T account. So first step in T account, you make a T, and then you put the name of the account. So T account for cash. Next, the first question is, ano ang normal balance ng cash? Anyone? Debit. So dahil asset siya, the normal balance is debit. Now, titingnan lang natin yung columns. Anytime na may increase, that would be a debit because it follows the normal account. Anytime na may decrease, let's do credit. So now, 435,000 increase, that's a debit. Negative 120, nag-decrease raw, so that's a credit. Nag-decrease raw ng 80, that's a credit in cash. Nag-increase ng 450 because of revenue, that's a debit. 250,000, nag-increase, that's a debit. Lahat ng 21, 55, 38, and 405, all of those are decreases. So all of them should go to credit. And then finally, may isa pang humabol, 40,000 debit kasi nag-increase. The next step is, kailangan natin kunin yung subtotals. Right? So, may dalawang linya. So, the one here, these are just subtotals. So, we add, right? Basically, 435, sorry, hindi ko alam paano pakita yun. Yeah, sorry. So, just solve with me. 435 plus 450 plus 250 plus 40,000 would be 1.175, right? And then credit, 120 plus 80 plus 21 plus 5.5 plus 38 plus 405 should equal negative 669,500. So you have a debit of 1.175 and then a credit of 669.5. Now the question is, pagbabanggain natin sila. Sino yung mas malaking number? Si 1.175 million. So 1.175 million minus 669,500, you will ultimately arrive with a positive 505,500. So ang ending balance ni cash is debit 505,500. Ang beginning balance niya, since kaka-start ng company, is 0. So the T account will tell you three things. Ano yung beginning balance ni cash? 0. Ano yung ending balance ni cash? 505,000. Paano naging 505,000? 505,500 from 0? It will tell you the changes. These are your changes. And then each change or each plug-in will signify one economic event that impacted cash, right? So, yeah. So 505. So nagbalance. So we're correct in terms of like RT account. Let's do another example. Accounts payable and expense. First step in making a T account, let's make the T's. And then let's categorize first. Accounts payable are what? Anong account type siya? Asset, liabilities, owner's equity. Liabilities. Account payable. So payable. So receivable assets. So accounts payable are liabilities. Liabilities are on your right, which means ano yung normal balance ni accounts payable? Credit. How about expense? Expense is usually debit or credit yung normal balance niya. Debit kasi negative siya on the right, so nilipat natin siya. So good. So alam na natin yung normal balance. So let's first focus on accounts payable. Accounts payable, nag-increase raw siya by 70,000. Ang normal balance is credit. So the 70,000 should be what? A credit or a debit? Credit. Correct. So, 78, sorry. And then yung isa, nag-decrease siya. So it should go against the normal balance. So that should be a debit. So let's subtotal 78, 38. Pagbabanggain natin siya, sino yung mas malaki? Si 78 minus 38, you'll eventually end with 40,000. So ano, what will it tell you that the account for accounts payable? The beginning balance of 0. The ending balance is a credit of 40,000. So 40,000 increase the accounts payable. And then the different changes, which is you can find here in the T account. For expense, again, the normal balance would be a debit. So debit. So ano yung mga expenses? So ito, mga expenses. So basically kasi negative siya means nag-increase siya, right? So wag lang tayo malito. So basically nag-increase the expense. So lahat yan debits. Right? So nakikita niyo parang nagiging consistent naman siya na yeah, so may balance. So we subtotal everything 563,000. So wala naman tayong ibabangga. So it's a debit of 563,000. So ganun lang, I want you to parang just memorize and really understand how to make your three accounts, because if there's one thing na parang siyang magic, because by using this debit and credit system, eventually magbabalance lahat through the journal entry. So that's something that we'll discuss later, right? So any questions before we go into the steps in the recording process? Or clear pa naman so far? Yes, go ahead.
Actually, about the beginning balance. How do you read that?
Good question. So honestly, if it was like a really full T account, there should be a beginning dun sa side, like here, parang beg, and then usually it's on the normal account side. So for example, account payable, may beg ka dito, and then 0. And then yung 78 technically dapat nandito. And then the debit should be here. And then for expense naman, debit, so here 0 dapat, and then yeah. But good question. So good practice lang to do that, but then for illustrative purposes, we just took note of the changes. Good question. Anything else? Yeah. Sorry. For me, yeah. So actually, for the accounts, understood na siya. So if it's here, kahit nilagay niya 38, that would mean na, okay, counterbalance. So that should be a negative, right? Pero the reason why I put this is that for the people that are coming in accounting for the first time, we're coming in from advanced transaction analysis. So gusto ko lang ipakita na nililipat lang natin siya technically. But okay lang na this art doesn't have like a negative sign. Pero dapat alam niyo lang na papagbaglayin niyo siya na hindi. Yeah.
So sa ano po namin, sa tinatawag, like maglalagay po kami ng
Sorry, beginning?
Yes.
Well, I think most of the time, well, good practice, so just put beginning. Pero, you can put naman the beginning.
Then, 0.
0. Pwede rin yan.
Sa debit, under debit, under credit.
Typically, ilagay mo siya kung saan yung normal account. So, basically, kung expense, beg 0 debit. Yeah. Thank you for the questions. Okay. So now medyo clear na tayo. So I know medyo mahirap intindihin right now. So please go back. Pero please, I think ito yung magiging foundation of all of your accounting. Dapat memorize nyo na kung ano yung mga debits and your credits. So now we understand na, okay, what are accounts? Alam na rin natin yung T account. Now let's go to the steps in the recording process, right? So ano ba yung recording process? Basically, it's three things, right? Analyze the transaction, journalize the entries, and then post to ledger accounts. So basically, tapos na tayo sa analyzing the transactions, right? We're done with the advanced transaction analysis. We're now in the second part. Let's now create a journal entry per transaction. So if you look at bullish launch agency, 12 to. So what we expect would be, probably we need 12 journal entries. And then, if you count naman yung vertical, may 10 accounts tayong nag-affect for the period. Cash, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So may 10 tayong account ledgers or 10 T accounts for that particular period. So don't worry, I know hindi pa familiar account ledger, but in essence, an account ledger is just a formal version of a T account. So simply, ang sinasabi lang natin here is that step 1, analyze the transactions. Step 2, create journal entries. Step 3, make your T accounts, pero yung formal version lang nun would be an account ledger. So now, let's first go to analyze the transactions. So, okay, number 1, basic transaction analysis, advanced transaction analysis, it's not really required. It's really more of a way for you to understand na there are different economic events, but at the end of the day, dapat mag-balance yung assets is equal to liabilities and equity. Later, pwede ka na mag-go straight to creating journal entries per economic event, right? So, saan natin ma-analyze yung mga transactions? Well, basically, we look at accounting documents. So, usually, from academic point of view, ang makikita nyo lang naman is economics events 1 to 12. Pero if ever you do practice accounting outside of the academe, kayo yung gagawa ng events, kayo yung gagawa ng 12 economic events. And how do you look at it? Through accounting documents. Kapag meron kayong revenue that will probably come in from either a sales invoice, the bill, may mga official receipts kayo, contracts, vouchers, deposit slips. So those would signify either may revenues kayo, may expenses kayo, may utang kayo sa bank, etc., etc. So through these accounting documents, you'll be able to list down ano ba yung mga economic events that will happen. So here, it looks complicated because 12 siya kaagad. But in practical sense, you should write the economic event as they come, right? So kung may nakuha kayong invoice, then doon kayo mag-write na economic event. You build it day to day until you have the full month. So tapos na tayo mag-analyze, right? The next step is to create RT accounts, right? So learn how to create RT accounts from our advanced transaction analysis. So for this, let's just I highlighted 4 sample out of the 12. So huwag kayong magulat kung yung balance nila wouldn't balance with the answers to the problem set 1. This is more of an illustrative purpose lang on parang from advanced transaction analysis, paano nyo siya gagawin T account, right? So let's start. So may advanced transaction analysis table tayo. And then let's go to economic event 1. Invested 435,000 cash to start the agency. Before, ang ginawa natin was what? In-increase natin si cash and in-increase natin si owner's capital. Now, alam natin na, okay, ilan yung accounts na na-impact? Dalawa, right? So, gagawa tayo ng T accounts for cash, T accounts for owner's capital. So, this is my suggestion. Per economic activity, para hindi kayo matakot, pag may natamaan account, doon lang kayo gumawa ng T account. So, natamaan si cash, natamaan si owner's capital, gawa tayo ng T accounts for each. Now, let's do the analysis. Tumaas si cash ng 435,000. I know na that would be a normal balance of debit. So that would be, so owner's capital, baliktad, the normal balance is credit. So tumaas si 435 si owner's capital, so credit 435,000. And then debit si cash ng 435,000. What do you notice? The debit of cash is equal to the credit of owner's capital. One economic event na balance, right? So debit is equal to credit. Next, nag-incur ka ng 78 advertising costs. That would be an increase in your accounts payable kasi on account. So may utang ka na 78 and then may expense ka of 78. What happened? So first step, Okay, natamaan si accounts payable and expense, gawa tayo ng T accounts. Gumawa tayo ng T accounts. Next is expense. Yung negative 78 connotes na tumaas si expense by 78,000. So ano yung normal balance na expense? Debit. So debit 78,000. And then si accounts payable, tumaas na 78, credit naman yung normal balance niya. So credit 78,000. So again, may balance. Debit of 78,000 expense is equal to your credit of your accounts payable at 78,000. Next, ito medyo mas complicated kasi it will affect 3 accounts. Performed services worth 650,000. So ano yan? That's a 650,000 service revenue. And then may 250 cash and 400,000 receivable. Okay, may cash na tayong T account. So may dalawa lang bago. Si receivable at si revenue, right? So, ano yung gagawin natin? First step is si cash, right? Tumaas si cash, so debit cash of 250,000. Si receivable, tumaas rin. So debit, receivables 400. Si revenue, ang normal balance ni revenue is credit. So credit 650,000. So for this, the debit of cash plus the debit of receivables of 250 and 400 is equal to the credit of revenue of 650,000. Balance pa rin tayo. And then finally, you paid Facebook 38,000 for the amount due in the transaction. So yung accounts payable mo nabawasan. And then si cash, nabawasan rin. So both decrease. So ang magandang thing here is wala na tayong bagong T account. So bumaba si cash. So now, instead of debit, that would be a credit in cash. And then, si accounts payable naman, ang normal balance na is credit. So, nag-decrease raw siya ng 38. So, that should be a debit instead. So, debit of 38,000 accounts payable is equal to the credit in cash of 38,000. So, debit is equal to credit. Next step, subtotal nyo lang lahat. So, subtotal. And then, pagbangga nyo. So, mas malaki si 635 kaysa sa kay 38. So, bawasan lang natin 597. Ito, pagbanggain mo si accounts payable, 40,000. So again, huwag kayong malito na hindi lang ito pareho because you just took account into 4 out of the 12 economic events. So any questions sa T accounts advanced transaction analysis before we proceed? Okay, so actually yun na yung mahirap. Now is the parang more of like yung parang housekeeping in terms of like creating our journal entries, right? So what are journal entries, right? So alam na natin yung account. Alam na natin yung T accounts that it will tell you the stories of these accounts which are building blocks. Now, parang like what I said, accounting kasi is creating a story. And syempre, in order for you to create your story for the business, you have to have a diary or a book. Or in this case, a journal. So ang tawag sa journal, so this is more of a theory question, is it's called the book of original entry. Meaning, magjo-journal ka lang because may nangyari. So day 1, nag-invest ako ng pera. Day 2, umupa ako sa Tomas Morato. So it's a chronological record of transactions. So literally, day 1, day 2. And then, ang importante sa journal is it shows the debit and credit of a transaction on the specific accounts. So what it means is that it follows a double entry system. So what does that mean? Double entry meaning, napapansin nyo, at least 2 accounts are affected per economic event, right? So may left and right siyang impact. That's the reason why it's called a double entry system. But please take note na even though it's a double entry system, it doesn't mean that it only affects 2 accounts. So to show you proof, going back, let's look at September 6. Noong September 6, it affected 3 accounts, cash, receivables, and revenue. But then naging double entry siya because your debits of cash and receivable of 250 and 400 is equal to your revenue of 650,000. So basically, 3 important things to note. It's the book of original entry. It's recorded chronologically. And then ang importante sa kanya is it shows the debit and credit effect. That's why we call it the double entry system. So now, there are different types of journals. You have your general journal and then your specific journal. Yung general journal, lahat ng company transactions, dun yung ilalagay. So anything that happens to the company, that, syempre, economic event. So, dapat monetary unit, it's consequential. Dun yung ilalagay. Pero you'll have special journals. So the question is, why do you have to have special journals? Because meron kang different managers, meron kang different decision makers na instead of the whole business, they want a particular insight on specific accounts, right? So, pare, sales manager ka, you want to look at sales journal. Purchasing manager ka, you want a purchase journal. Ikaw yung in charge of cash management and liquidity. Siyempre, what you want to look are cash receipts journal and cash disbursement journal, right? So, again, you have your general journal, lahat ng company transactions nandun, and then yung special journal, mga similar types of transactions. So, ito yung itsura niya, honestly. So, ito yung formal look of a journal. So, sa general journal, anything that happens in the sun, lalagay niya, right? And then, compared to sa special, napapansin nyo, it's simpler, right? But parang si customer A, si cash sales, etc., etc. Because we know it's cash receipts. Meaning, alam na natin na all of these accounts will affect cash receipts. Either through the form of a sale or in the form of like may nakuha kayong accounts receivable from the cash receipts. So I know it looks a bit intimidating, a bit sorry, kind of ignore na yung work messages. So yun, so basically yun lang yung mangyayari. So now the journal entry is the formal entry of a transaction to a journal. So again, in chapter 1, pinahirapan namin kayo by making you create a table. But in chapter 2, honestly, parang the expectation is pagkabasa niyo nito, invested 435,000. Rather than make a table, you can create a journal entry wherein technically that's a debit in cash and a credit in owner's equity. So this is just simple. So I'll go through naman what a journal entry is. Pero basically, this is what it would look like. Slight typo lang, it should be 0901. So later we'll talk about it. So what are the components of a journal entry, right? So number 1, honestly, okay, so full disclosure, ito yung formal way. So ito yung pinaka-kompleto. But at the end of the day, parang in your quizzes or in your exams, parang what you need to do lang is literally write debit blank, credit blank, right? So, ang kukunin nyo lang is cash and then DR, owner's equity, CR. But then it's good to know for theory and also for para lang hindi kayo malito if you ever come across this. What are the different parts? So, number 1 is date. So, it has to be journaled chronologically, right? Next would be your reference numbers. So, like what I mentioned, each account has a reference number. So, for Bullish Launch Agency, it's cash 101, owner's equity 301. So, para lang mahanap nyo. Third, what are the third? Credit. So, you should have at least 1 credit. So, ang credit natin is owner's equity. Kindly take note na mukha siyang naka-indent. So, yung pag naka-indent, tapos nasa second line, that signifies a credit. Pero kindly put na rin credit. So, nakausog lang siya. 1 line. Debit, at least 1 debit, so cash. So, kindly take note time saying at least 1, at least 1 credit, at least 1 debit. It doesn't matter kung ilan yung credits and debits nyo on a per journal entry, pero ang importante is that your debits and credits should equal to each other. And then lastly, you have your explanation. So again, for me, ang importante lang is the debit, the credit, and then the values. Yun lang. Pero please take note na if in the quiz they ask you, write the formal entry, it should have these 5 things. The date, the reference number, and the explanation should be included. So why is it again a double entry accounting system? Because basically you have your cash on the left, debits on the left, you have your owner's equity, credits on the right. It should balance, right? Kaya siya double entry. So so making sure na you're balanced every transaction. So now, let's try to apply. So kanina pinagawa ko kayo T accounts, right? Now, let's do paano tayo mag-journal entry for these specific 4 accounts, right? So ito yung T accounts natin. This is where we left off, but honestly, medyo intimidating siya, right? So rather than that, let's just make journal entries per account, right? So again, cash, owner's capital. Technically, tumaas si cash, tumaas si owner's capital. So paano yun? Debit, cash of 435,000. Credit, owner's equity of 435,000, right? So debit is equal to credit. Next, incurred 78,000 of advertising costs for Facebook ads on account. So tumaas yung expense, tumaas yung accounts payable. So, muna, mag-debit tayo. Debit expense, advertising expense, credit accounts payable of 78,000. So again, the debit of advertising expense of 78,000 is equal to the credit of accounts payable. Next, ito, 3 accounts yung affected. Tumaas yung revenue of 650,000 and tumaas si cash and receivables. So how do we record this? Debit cash of 250,000, tumaas si cash. Debit accounts receivable, 400,000, tumaas si receivable. Credit service revenue, tumaas si service revenue, 650,000. Now, this is what you call a compound journal entry, in contrast to a simple journal entry. So bakit siya compound? Because it involves at least 3 accounts. Pero what do you notice? The ones on the left, or your debit of 250 and 400, is equal pa rin to your credits on your right, which is 650, right? So, nababalance pa rin yung double entry accounting system. Finally, journal entry. Basically, parang nag-pay ka raw ng utang mo sa liability. So, nag-decrease si cash, nag-decrease si accounts payable. So, ano ang decrease ng cash? That's a credit. Anong decrease ng accounts payable? That's a debit. So, debit accounts payable of 38,000, credit cash of 38,000. Yeah, go ahead, Allen. Okay. So, in essence, every transaction, every date, gagawa ka ng journal entry. So, kung may 12 kayo, then you expect 12. Pero syempre, ignore those that doesn't have any economic effect. So, these are basically a story. So, ito yung bread and butter nyo sa accounting. If you know the journal entries for any particular topic, you know how to create the T accounts, you'll honestly do well in any of the accounting quizzes. Paano lang kayo mahirapan? The steep learning curve. Hindi siya ganun ka-intuitive, right? So, for me, please master how to journalize and please master kung ano yung mga normal accounts para gets nyo kagad how to analyze each of the transactions. So, I think by now, you're starting to realize also na accounting is really more of reading comprehension rin and knowing the systems more than anything else. So, how you can parang really work on it is do a lot of exercises and be careful. So, I really appreciate those na nag-call out ng ending, like, good job. And I hope all of you noticed that also. So, yun lang naman yung mga tricks eh. Minsan, bibigyan kayo ng beginning pero ending pala yung hinihingi. Or parang sabihin nila at the start of the year pero mid na pala. So, it's really more of like the intricacies of detail and organization. So, yun yung thing and request namin for each and every one of you. So now, basically, we're now into, okay, we're done now with journalizing. The last step is knowing how to post transactions and what are ledger accounts. So in that learning objective 4, it was what is a journal? There is another thing that you need to know, and that is a ledger. So what is a ledger? A ledger basically is your summary of changes, and then it's also performed in chronological order, and that all debits and credits of one entry should be posted and should be made on a timely basis. So naka-underline lang naman yung key characteristics. If looking at or hearing these descriptions, you suddenly think, isn't that the same as a T account? Well, that's right. So like what I've mentioned, a ledger is just a formal version of a T account because technically it's a summary of changes. It's chronological order, and then it's all about one account. So here is an exact example of a cash ledger. So let's break down the different components. So you have 6 columns for a ledger. So you start off with, start off muna tayo with row 1. A ledger will comprise of the name of the account. So cash. Ano yung 101? That is the reference number. Number 2, ano yung mga different headers natin? You have your date, your explanation, your reference, your debits, your credits, and finally your balance. So let's start. So the date is September 2022. So on September 1, you had a debit of 435,000. So you start off with 0 balance at the start, right? And then mayroon kang debit of 435,000. So a debit increases cash. So next, yung balance mo on September 1 is 435,000. So and then second, September 2, nagkaroon ka ng credit. So nabawasan ka ng 120,000. So now the balance mo ng September 2 is 315,000. So what's the beauty of a ledger? If I ask you now, what is the cash balance ng September 9? What do you think that would be? September 9. Correct. So 870,500. Kasi sa 9, you just look at the balance. So as you can see, per date, you solve for the balance. So, correct. Coming from 315,000, nabawasan ka ng 80,000. So yung balance mo ng September 3 is 315,000 minus 80,000 is equal to 235,000. So I know it's intimidating, pero what I want rather than you being able to make a ledger account is you just understand how to read it, right? So alam mo niyo lang kung okay, debit and credit, right? So like what I mentioned, if a journal entry is basically a formal entry of a transaction to a journal. So basically, para Bullish Launch Agency invested 435,000, and then you have cash owner's equity of 435 and credit of owner's equity. So from the analysis, you just made a journal entry. Yung T account is the formal, yung T account, ang formal version lang niya is the account ledger. So itong cash na pinaghirapan natin gawin at the start of the lesson, basically, yun lang rin naman yung nasa T account eh. Debit of 435, credit of 120, and then credit of 80, debit of 450, debit of 250, and then the credits from 21,000 all the way to 405,000, and then meron kang debit of 40,000. The only difference is that sa ledger, gumagawa ka lang ng balance every time may impact siya. So it looks intimidating just because ito full month na to. But on a practical basis, ginagawa mo siya araw-araw naman. So hindi naman siya dapat ma-affect. So now, how do we post? How do we post the transaction, right? So may journal entry ka. And because of the double entry accounting system, mayroong 2 accounts na na-affect. So basically, you'll just plug it into 2 different ledgers, right? So debit cash, credit owner's equity. So yung debit nito in 101, we will put in the 101 cash ledger. Yung credit ng owner's equity of 435,000, ilalagay natin sa 301 owner's equity. So, paano itsura nun? September 1, babasagin natin yung journal entry and then ipopost natin. So, 435,000, 435,000. Owner's equity, credit, owner's equity. So, yung balance mo ng September 1 for your owner's capital would be 435,000. So with that, honestly, tapos na tayo when it comes to yung major recording process, right? We're able to analyze the transactions already. So again, basic and advanced transaction analysis, this is just to guide you, but hindi siya required. Pero ang importante is you understand per economic event how to account for it. Number 2, we know na how to journalize our entries. And then number 3, we know na how to post. So step 1, advanced transaction analysis. Step 2, journal entry per transaction, 12. And then account ledger per account would be 10 because 10 yung accounts that are affected, right? So again, analyze the transaction, journalize the entry, and then post to the ledger account, right? So are there any questions before we move on to the trial balance? Okay. So clear. So honestly, if I had to break the session into 2, basically ganun lang naman yun. So now that we know the post, and now that we know how to create a ledger, now let's do the trial balance, right? So let's start. So a trial balance, so tatlo na yung important accounting terms, right? Journal, ledger, and then finally trial balance. Trial balance is your list of accounts and balance. And ano yung major purpose ng trial balance? Honestly, it's just to make sure na your debits and your credits balance. So basically, similarly, so ano yung similarities natin? Ang income statement and ang changes in owner's equity, yung 2 statements na yon is for a period. So ang third row niya is for the month ended, for the period ended, etc., etc. Versus financial position na it's a point in time, it's a snapshot, so it's a specific date. So ang kapareho niya is si trial balance, right? So si trial balance has to be as of September 30, 2022. Ano yung components ni trial balance? Basically, it's just a list of your accounts, and then you have to list your debits and your credits. So now, for the format. For the format, start first with your assets. So cash, accounts receivable, supplies, equipment. All of those are assets. Next, write down your liabilities. Ano yung liabilities natin? Accounts payable, notes payable, credit sila. Third, write down your equity component starting with your owner's capital, next with your owner's drawings, so 435,000 and 21,000. And then finally, revenues and then your expenses. So revenues and then expenses. So looking at it, makikita nyo kaagad kung sino yung nasa left and nasa right. Cash, AR, supplies, equipment, assets, service, owner's drawings, and expenses are all have normal debit accounts. On the other hand, the ones on your right, your liabilities, which is basically your accounts payable, notes payable, owner's capital, and your revenues are your credits. And then when you add each of them, so 505,500 plus 360,000 all the way until 178,000, it should total 1.575 million. And then your credits of 40,000 plus 450,000 plus 435,000 plus 650,000 is equal to 1.575 million, right? So again, paulit-ulit lang, but your debits should always equal your credits. And then yung expanded accounting equation natin is this. Assets plus expense plus owner's drawings is equal to liabilities plus owner's capital plus revenue. So again, bakit yung expense yung owner's drawings nasa left side na kaagad? Because subtract, technically, it's assets plus liability, assets is equal to liabilities plus owner's capital minus owner's drawings plus revenue minus expense. Basically, nilipat lang natin lahat ng negative from the right all the way to the left para lahat sila positive. Kaya yun yung debits and credits natin. Right? So now, let's just recreate this trial balance. So ano yung mga steps? Step 1, know the format. Row 1, name of the company, Bullish Launch Agency. Row 2, what is the statement of the account? Trial balance. Row 3, September 30, 2020. So kailangan as of. Please, as of. So sayang yung points if hindi lang tama yung labels. Next, let's put the DR on one side, credit on the right side, DR on the left side, credit on the right side, and then the accounts. Let's start first with what? The assets. Cash. Assets. So si assets, ang ending balance raw niya is 505,000. So that's an increase. So 505,000. Receivables, 360,000. 360,000. Supplies, 5,500. And then si equipment, 120,000. Next, we go to liabilities. So liabilities, accounts payable, 40,000. Notes payable, 450,000. So lahat yun nag-increase, so that's credit. Owner's capital increase at 435,000. The normal balance is credit. So credit 435,000. Owner's drawings of 21,000 is a debit. And then revenue, ang ano niya is credit ulit, 650,000. And then finally, you'll have your expenses of debit of 405,000 for salaries expense, 80,000 for rent expense, and then 70,000 for advertising expense. Please note that similarly to income statement and financial position, for assets, please order them by liquidity. So cash, AR, supplies, equipment. For expenses, please order them by magnitude. So biggest first and then least impactful the last, right? So now, pagkatapos yung i-plug in kung sino yung debit and credit, so ang pina-plug in natin sa trial balance would be their ending balances. We just add the debits, add the credits, and then if you add those, you'll get 1.575 and 1.575 debits and credits. So the debits should equal your credits, right? So now we know this. For this, let's do an exercise breakdown, right? So for the next 10 minutes or 5 minutes, kindly write five journal entries using the Kevin Trin welding for the month of June. So basically this is just an exercise. So pang bonus points lang for participation. And then kindly submit it at the end, pero we'll discuss it naman. So basically what we can do is write yung journal entry. So for this, request ko is formal journal entry. Right now wala tayong cash chart of accounts. So just categorize them in the way that makes sense for you. But I just want you to go through ano ba yung debits, ano ba yung credits. So make 5 journal entries. And then after you make the 5 journal entries, try to make your own T accounts also in the next 10 minutes. So it's 9:20. So
Sabi mo po diba yung date, yung...
yeah, correct. Date.
May ganyan pa, pero ano.
No need. So sorry. I'll write a sample journal entry. Okay. Yeah, sorry. So basically just write the date and then debits and your credits. Yun lang. Basically yun lang naman for the file. So yeah. Yeah, sure. No na. So yeah.
Kasi wala rin po reference. Wala rin po reference.
Wala mo na reference because wala tayong chart of account. Yeah. And then paano niya binili?
Or expensive.
So, okay. So, sorry. So, yung question is yung sa equipment, right? So, yung clue for two is, what is equipment? Parang asset, right? So, the question is, ano yung second account? I think yung clue here is, paano niya binili, right? Is it cash? Bumaba ba si cash? Or umutang ba siya? So, I think yun yung way to think about it. So, tumaas yung equipment. So, either bumaba si cash or umutang siya. So, tumaas si accounts payable. Yeah. So, yun yung choices. Yeah. So,
Expensive.
hindi siya expense kasi rather than expense, parang tumaas yung assets niya. Hindi siya, so, for equipment or parang mga big purchases, hindi siya equipment expense. It's more of like, tumaas yung assets niyo. So, for example, bumili ako ng laptop. I can use that to generate assets. So, ang category ng equipment is asset. So, kung may asset kang tumaas, paano mo binili yung equipment? Yun yung next na tanong. So, either tumaas equipment, bumaba si cash. So, that's debit equipment, credit cash. Or umutang ka, so debit equipment, credit accounts payable. So, something to think about. And then, yeah, we'll discuss rin naman. So, last 5 minutes. So, yun. So, journal entry for those na tapos na kung Magis, kindly do the accounts rin and then parang try to solve for the ending balance. And then, more than parang getting it right, I want you to find yung mga statements that are weird. Kasi yun yung mga statements na kailangan yung, okay, next time nakita ko tong statement na to, ito yung journal entry for that. So, I know medyo hindi siya intuitive at first. So, kaya exercise. So, try your best lang and then figure out ano yung interpretation that you need to make sense para ma-memorize nyo na yung journal entry for each of the economic events. Okay, sige. I think we can start. So, again, thank you so much for ano. So, eto lang. So, the reason why I wanted you to do this is because parang, again, it's not enough na you know how to solve it correctly. You also have to do it fast. So, honestly, within the 15 minutes, ang expectation is three things. Number one, dapat not journalize niya na. Number two, dapat nagawa niya na yung accounts. And then number three, nagawa niya na yung trial balance. So, ganun ka time pressure yung parang ideal. Ay, kasi yun talaga. So, so, okay. Kasi first time natin diniscuss to, right? So, kaya matagal pa, right? So, with the problem set 2, talagang aralin niyo how to do the journal. Hindi siya pwedeng, paano ulit to? Parang, ano ba ang accounts? Hindi pwedeng ganun. Dapat pagkabasa nyo, debit ganito, credit ganito. And then, caveat naman nun, parang yun na yung whole long prob, right? Long prob na yun. So, that's a bulk of the point. So, parang aside from mastery, kailangan mabilis rin kayo. So, for me, ang step 1 ko is, okay lang sa akin nagkamali kayo today. I think okay lang sa akin yun. Lahat naman, hindi naman to graded. So, parang it's more of like, alamin nyo kung ano yung transactions that, bakit siya weird? So, thank you so much for the question. Like, weird, bakit equipment hindi siya expense? And then, pag-usapan natin, right? So, kung may tanong kayo kung bakit ganun yung journal entry, pag-usapan natin now, right? So, now, step 1. June 1, Kevin Trin invests 4,400 cash in a small wedding. Okay, madali lang to. Keywords. Nag-invest siya. 4,400. So alam natin cash is a component. Nag-invest. Invest is the keyword. Owner's capital. Right? So tumaas pareho. Tumaas si cash. So that's gonna be debit cash. Tumaas si owner's equity kasi nag-invest siya. So that is 4,400, 4,400. Right? So simple enough. Right? So sa mga ganitong situations, straightforward, debit cash, credits, owner's equity. Number 2, purchase equipment on account for 990. Now, very good question. Equipment, for parang hindi kayo sanay, sounds like an expense, right? Like, why? Naglabas ako ng cash or umutang ako. I bought a laptop, right? So, for example, let's apply the Kevin Trin. Bumili siya ng welding equipment. Why shouldn't that be an expense? Because yung equipment na yon can get you future benefits. Literally, you'll buy one equipment, you'll use it for 2 years. Tapos madami ka ng magagawang trabaho. So rather than it categorizing it as an expense outright, it's an asset muna. And then, during the life of that asset, eventually, magdi-depreciate siya, and then magiging siyang expense. But at the start, and ito yung parang, okay, kung hindi nyo naintindihan yun, memorize nyo lang na equipment asset. So pag may nakita kang equipment, bumili siya ng equipment, debit equipment of 990. The next question is, okay, bumili siya. Two things lang naman yan eh. Either bumaba cash mo or tumaas accounts payable mo kasi umutang ka. Pero yung keyword dito is on account. So pag may on account, automatic payable. So tumaas yung equipment mo, tumaas yung accounts payable, debit equipment, credit, accounts payable. 990. Right? Any questions? Here, okay. 3. 880 cash is paid to the landlord for June rent, right? So, ito, di ko alam kung sino nag-accounting sa inyo in advance. Nadadali kayo here because some people would confuse it with the concept of prepaid rent, which is another asset. For those na hindi, I think that's the edge na hindi nyo pa yun narinig. For prepaid rent, ang assurance ko sa inyo is for it to be prepaid rent, lalagay namin in advance, right? Or for 6 months. Yun yung clue na prepaid rent. Pero kung outright, and specifically for chapter 2 and chapter 1, hindi lalabas sila prepaid kasi hindi namin tinuro, right? So, 880 cash is paid for the landlord for rent. So, meaning, na-consume mo na yung rent, right? That should be a rent expense. And then, naglabas ka ng cash, bumaba si cash. So, debit rent expense, credit cash. And then, yun, bills. Long for 930 for welding work done. So pag keyword bill, may binil akong client, that's a revenue on my end. Service revenue, correct. So now the question is, natanggap mo ba yung pera or hindi? Pag natanggap mo, it should be debit cash, credit, service revenue. Pero kung hindi mo pa na tinanggap, sabi niya, wait lang, parang end of the month, maghintay muna ako payday kasi naubos yung pera ko, etc. etc. So that would be, ang keyword dito is on account. So keywords is bill, service revenue, on account, accounts receivable. So tumaas si accounts receivable. Debit accounts receivable, 930. Credit, service revenue. Last, June 19, received 450. So si Jay Long, sabi niya, oh, nag-payday na ako. Out of my 930, babayaran kita ng 450. So receive 450, ang keynote doon is nakatanggap ka ng cash. So tumaas si cash, debit cash, and then for the previously billed work, meaning na take note mo na may utang siya. So bababa lang yung utang niya ng accounts receivable sa'yo. So that would mean bababa si accounts receivable pero tataas si cash. So debit cash, 450, credit accounts receivable. Right? So now, basically, straightforward, may 5 accounts na tayo. So basahin nyo lang, 1 minute, yeah. Sorry. Okay, sorry. 250. So, sorry, 450 yan dapat. So, 450. Yeah. Yun. Pero good catch. Yun. So, let's say, so basically, pero ang importante doon is, dapat tama yung debits and yung credits. Yun. So now, dala tayo with the journal entries. Right? So, ang pinaka-hit ko talaga is pag sa quiz, pinapati account ako. Kasi parang hassle gawin, honestly. So, basically, para hindi ako ma-intimidate, do it per journal entry. So, again, sino yung unang natamaan? Si cash and owner's equity. Hindi gagawa ako ng owner's capital and cash. And then, debit. So, debit on the right. Ay, on the left. And then, credit on the right. And then, equipment accounts payable. Okay, hindi gagawa ako ng bagong T account. So, again, debit 990, so left ng PPE. And then credit accounts payable, so right ng accounts payable. Okay, rent expense cash. Isa lang yung bago, so gagawa ko ng account ng expense. And then, debit expense of 880. Credit of cash of 880. And then, gagawa ako ng AR kasi wala pa and service revenue. And then, debit AR, service revenue 930. And then finally, cash AR. So, ito na yung kompleto ko na yung T-accounts ko. So, debit cash, 450. Credit AR, 450. So, done. And then, I think good question at the start. As you notice, wala na tayong mga subtractions, right? Clear na, nasa atin na. Kapag debit siya in cash, that means increases. So, get the subtotals. So, for 850, 880. So, mas malaki si 480, 850. So, subtract lang natin. So, you have a debit of cash of 3,970. And then, copy lang. So, no need. So, parang kung wala kayong oras, wag nang i-subtotal kasi wala naman kailangan ni bangga. So, just do the ending of owner's capital. Property, plant, equipment, etc., etc. So, just to give you a highlight of how the quizzes or the exams would work. Number one, important journal entries, right? So, yun yung bread and butter nyo. If you're good at journal entries, you'll probably do well. The second is that we'll probably ask a summary question. What does a summary question look like? What's the ending capital of accounts payable? Or what's the ending capital of receivables? So, ang sagot doon is 480. So, paano ka magkakamali doon? Kapag nagkamali ka sa isang entry doon, automatic mad ka na doon. So, it changes. So, take your time and dapat be accurate. Pero, for me, yung bread and butter mo is journal entries. For me, pumasa ako ng accounting kasi not that I understand I'm good at analyzing transactions. It's because minimemorize ko na keywords nito. Pag nakita ko tong word na to, ito yung ida-debit ko, ito yung i-credit ko. So, my request lang for you is parang go through the problem sets, make your journal entries. So, problem set 2, make your journal entries. Sa bullish launch agency, make your journal entries. Just try to make it make sense. And then the last challenge is financial statements and trial balances. For financial statements and trial balances, honestly, memorize lang yung format. As in literally, yun talaga parang mechanical na lang talaga. Kung tama-tama, kung mali-mali. Pero kung yung form okay, edi wala na kayong isipin. So, last step is trial balance. So, basically, yung form is name of the thing that we're doing. So, trial balance. And then, ano ulit yung note? Income statement, changes in owner's equity is for the period ending because it talks about the whole period. Pag as of or a snapshot, it's financial position or balance sheet and trial balance. So, as of. So, yung mga parang sign na mistakes is like 3 points rin yan. So, ipunin nyo na yun. And then, the format. right? So basically, we started assets. AR for 80, equipment 990, AP owner's capital 990, 440 yung owner's capital. 0 yung drawings kasi wala tayo. Service expense, revenue of 930, and then rent expense of 880. So total 6320, 6320. So that's it. So for me, important here talaga is your journal entries. Yun lang. Parang if you're good at journal entries, T accounts, very procedural. Trial balance, very procedural. Financial statements, very procedural. So ang importante is your analysis in terms of yung mga accounts. So I think that ends our lesson for today. So sakto, 9:45. Any questions?
How will you differentiate for yung accounts pabilities?
Sorry.
How will you differentiate for yung accounts pabilities? Yung mga parang receivable and payable.
Notes, accounts payable versus notes payable.
How will you like differentiate?
Okay. Good question. So, first, yung keyword natin is on account, right? So, usually, tatlo yung nako-confuse yung mga tao eh. Accounts receivable, accounts payable, notes payable. Yun yung tatlo. Pag may nakita kayong on account, tatanong mo lang, sino yung may utang? Ikaw ba or siya? Sa'yo. So, pag may utang ka sa ibang tao, that's accounts payable. May utang yung ibang tao sa'yo, that's accounts receivable. Now, liabilities. Anong difference sa accounts payable sa notes payable? Pag sinabing borrowed money from the bank, that's notes payable. So, pag bank or any parang financial institution na long term, that's notes payable. Pero literally, kung utang ako sa kaibigan ko, that's an accounts payable. May utang ka sa suppliers, accounts payable. So notes payable, ang pinaka easiest way for me to remember is kapag bank or any financial institution, notes payable. Yun. Are there any questions pa? Yeah, go ahead.
Bill, so bill ko is a couple service service. Oh, is that actually for the task is done now? Or what if the task is still ongoing?
Okay, good question. So, again, that's a more of an advanced question. So, parang in service, ideally, binil mo na pag tapos ka na, right? Meron kasing unearned service revenue, meaning binayaran mo ko in advance, hindi ko pa nagawa. That's a chapter 3 discussion, right? So, for me, two things. So, pag build, kailangan connoted, tapos na. Yun yung assumption. And then, dun mo kailangan i-recognize yung revenue. Correct. And then, pag sinabi naman parang build someone pero the service is not yet done, dun yung connotation na unearned pa siya. Pero for those na parang ayaw nung simple, chapter 1, chapter 2, wala pa tayo nung complex. So wala pang prepaid rent, wala pang unearned service revenue. So don't worry, parang no need for those advanced concepts. Ang promise ko naman sa inyo is, kung ano ilalabas sa quiz, yung pinag-usapan lang natin here. So yung mga accounts na yun, park it muna for that. And then that's a chapter 3 discussion, but super good question. Any other questions? So last reminders. So number 1, thank you so much for the 8:15 start. Ang assurance ko naman is I'm trying to do housekeeping announcements na lang there para you can wish sa recording, and then habol na lang yung mga 8:30. Now the question is, on Friday next week we'll have our first quiz. So combination siya of chapters 1 and chapters 2. So I think for module 1 you'll have 3 quizzes. So please attend kasi again, ang medyo strict yung rule na if you miss it, you'll get 75% of your lowest grade for the whole module, which is parang not really ideal for us. So please go. And then para fair, I will start. So my question is, do you want sa start or sa end? Kasi ako as a student, gusto ko tapos na para I can focus na on the, or gusto nyo end ng Friday? Start of class ng Friday, like 8:30, or end, like last 30 minutes of Friday? Start. Okay, and then, ang problem nun is, I'm not confident na you can make it on time, like 8:15. So, paano ba? Ganito na lang. I'll make a concession. We'll start at 8:30 on Friday pag may quiz. Hindi. So, okay. Net. Ang goal natin, ang request ko is attend kayo ng 8:15. Right? Pero kung wala pa yung mga tao, 8:30 na yung magsa-start. Pero officially, I'll start at 8:30 kasi yun yung commitment. Pero bakit ideal sa atin 8:15? Para I'll have time to explain naman chapter 3, right? Pero if ever hindi, then I'll record na lang after class and then panoorin nyo na lang. So yun lang naman yung mga trade-offs natin. But request 8:15 Friday, let's be here, let's take the quiz. Yun. And then, net kung late, any 8:30 I'll strictly start para fair to everyone. For me, again, important not only accurate, pero talagang fast, right? So, honestly, for exercises, okay lang sa akin if you discuss. Kung may questions kayo sa classmates nyo, I'll post discussion thread para you can ask your classmates. And then para mahanap rin natin kung may mga problems and errors for the ano. So, yun lang naman. And thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. Yeah.